I was at that age where being left home alone was thrilling. I was around 13 and my parents had just started trusting me to stay home alone overnight. The only rule was that I couldn't leave the house or have anyone over, which was fine by me. Something about blasting my music or video games without my dad telling me to turn it down was exhilarating. To make things even better, it was a rainy night that turned into a thunderstorm. I sat outside under the awning for a while, watching the storm roll in. I've always loved thunderstorms. They make staying indoors feel so much cozier. After a while, I moved my Xbox from my room to the downstairs den, setting it up on my dad's big flat-screen TV with the Bose sound system. I only got to play on it when I was home alone, and I loved it. The den was down a half flight of stairs from the living room, level with the backyard with a door that led outside. I was playing Black Ops in the den, headphones on, chatting with my friend Cody. I had an old headset, so the only sound I heard through it was other players' voices. For a 13-year-old, it was a perfect night until something interrupted my peace. The doorbell rang. It was after 9 p.m. by then. I told Cody about it, and he suggested I go check. I wondered if my parents had come home early, but they had a key, so they wouldn't need to ring the doorbell. I hid in a safe spot in the game and went upstairs to the front door, asking who's there. Looking back, I realized that was a mistake. A man's voice responded, "I need to use a phone." I didn't reply. Instead, I quietly went back downstairs. But it was too late. The stranger now knew I was home. I told Cody and he just said, "Yo, what the heck?" He agreed I shouldn't open the door. But then the doorbell rang again. Cody advised me to ignore it. And after a while, it seemed the person had left. I felt like I was on a roller coaster of emotions. 1 minute I was on edge, the next, I was relaxed and back in my game. Just as I was starting to feel at ease again, I heard something to my right. When I looked, I saw the back door closing and a tall man stepping inside. This was not my dad, it was a stranger. I dropped the controller, bolted to the office, and slammed the door shut behind me. The instant I locked it, the doorknob shook violently as the man tried to open it. The office had 2 doors, one leading to the den and another to the garage. My only option was to escape through the garage, but for a moment I just stood still, terrified, listening as the seconds crawled by. Then, the man knocked on the door and said, "Little boy, I just need to use your phone." His voice grew louder and more aggressive as he banged on the door, yelling, "Open the door, you little shit." It sounded like he was trying to break it down. My only choice was to go through the garage. I hit the button to open the garage door, hoping he wouldn't hear the loud motor. As soon as the door was halfway open, I crawled under it and ran through the storm to my neighbor Julian's house. I rang Julian's doorbell, glancing back at my house, praying I wouldn't see anyone following me. When he opened the door, I ran inside, explaining what happened as his wife came out of the kitchen in shock. Julian immediately called the police and stayed on the line while directing them to my house. It felt like ages before the police arrived. When they finally did, I watched from Julian's window as the officers surrounded my house. A few minutes later, they emerged with a man in handcuffs. They kept him from seeing me, but one of the officers asked if I knew him. I assured them I didn't. Apparently, the man, whose name was John McCarty, had told the officers that the house was his and that I was his son. It was clear he was either drunk, high, or just plain unstable. He was taken to jail, and my parents were notified to decide how to proceed. They pressed charges, and he was charged with criminal trespass. Knowing he'd eventually be out and aware of where I lived made me uneasy. Thankfully, it seemed like a random encounter rather than a targeted one. When he was finally released, he never came back. Hopefully, I don't dox myself by sharing this, but I'm a graffiti artist, or as some might call it, a delinquent. Either label is fine by me. The point is, I love spray painting, and I'm decent with a can in my hand. The tagging community is a mess. People aren't friendly, and there's little respect between artists. Because of this, I've developed a more inconspicuous routine. I like tagging quieter spots where my art likely won't be noticed by other artists or the general public. Old train lines are usually a good bet since abandoned trains end up on them all the time. My friend Lucas sometimes tags along, even though he's not that into it himself. I appreciate the company, especially since most of my other friends don't seem to understand or respect my interests the way he does. One night, Lucas and I found ourselves walking along some old, nameless set of train tracks that I'd spotted earlier on Google Maps. I'm not a big stoner, but Lucas smokes a lot, so I usually indulge a bit to match his vibe. It wasn't very late, maybe a little after 10 p.m. We had just finished a joint as we walked alongside an old, rusty freight train. Oddly enough, there wasn't a single tag on it. It looked newly moved, which meant I had first dibs on it. Excited, I tossed Lucas a can for him to play around with and got to work. About 15 minutes later, I'd finished 3 solid tags on adjacent cars. I was pretty proud of how they looked together. Now, I'll admit, I tend to toss my empty cans wherever they go dry. So I flung them back down the tracks, enjoying the sound of the ball bearing rattling inside. When I caught up with Lucas, he'd rolled another joint, barely even touching the paint can I gave him. For context, the reason I'm not big on smoking is that it gives me anxiety lately almost every time I smoke. In hindsight, 2 joints that night was a terrible decision, especially since we were doing something illegal. But I smoked anyway, figuring I'd be fine. Just as we finished the joint, we heard a muffled clank behind us. Lucas and I froze, staring into the darkness. I felt a drop of sweat trickling down my neck as my adrenaline kicked in. I couldn't tell if the sound came from outside the train or from one of the cars. Either way, both options were unsettling. We waited in silence for a minute, and when nothing happened, I pulled out my phone and started recording. As the video shows, whoever made that noise picked up one of my empty paint cans and threw it toward us before chasing us while yelling. You can't see the can in the video, but I swear that's what made the first sound. As we sprinted down the tracks, the person behind us shouted, "You better not trip, boy." Seconds later, we heard a gunshot echo behind us, nearly causing Lucas to stumble. My finger slipped off the record button on Snapchat, and the video cut off. We ran down the tracks until we hit a main road, not stopping until we were a safe distance away. I don't think I've ever been that terrified. Being stoned didn't help, my hands were shaking, and so were Lucas's. When we finally got back to the car, we drove home in silence. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? I was literally breaking the law, so that wasn't an option. But the story doesn't end there. A few weeks later, I went back to those tracks during the day, this time with my Glock 17, just in case. Surprisingly, the train was still there, but there was a noticeable difference. The spots where I'd left my tags were now covered in ugly red paint. Someone had deliberately tried to cover my work. I kept exploring and eventually came across a train car with its door wide open. I looked inside, and it was strange. The car was completely empty, except for a single chair in the center. There were ropes and chains scattered around, some of the ropes wrapped around the chair legs. The weirdest part, though, was the smell. The entire car reeked of bleach. If you closed your eyes, you'd think you were in a cleaning supply closet. The smell was so strong it felt like the entire car had been doused in it. I was about to take a picture when I thought I heard another metal clank further down the train. I might have imagined it, but I wasn't taking any chances. I left as fast as I could. I've told a few people this story, and no one has been able to explain that guy's actions in a way that makes sense. It seems unlikely a homeless person would have access to a gun, but I can't imagine why anyone else would react that aggressively. The most disturbing part of it all was the chair in the middle of that train car. I've thought about going back just to take a picture of it, but I haven't worked up the courage. I have no idea if that guy was actually trying to kill us or just scare us, but sometimes late at night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still hear that gunshot ringing in my ears. My name is Leo. To be completely honest, I'm a bit lost in life right now. I won't go into it too much, but all you need to know is that my family situation has been awful. For the past 3 years, I've done everything possible to avoid home. My close friends from high school have changed in ways I don't appreciate, and my hometown just feels empty now. I'm about to be a senior in college, and frankly, I have no idea what I'm going to do with my life after that. Enough of the sob story, though. Last year, I found myself in Berlin, searching for something, maybe a sense of purpose. I remember the bar I was in, Reduia, sitting alone as usual. I was just about to leave when I realized my apartment keys were missing. Just my luck. I stumbled out and headed toward my place, but when I got there, I found it locked up tight. At that late hour, there was no way to get a replacement set. Not sure what most people would do, but my first thought was to find somewhere to sleep. Then, as if my luck wasn't already terrible, it started raining. Eventually, I found a spot under a nearby bridge. I didn't even know where I was, but at least I was dry and out of the rain. As I was drifting off, I noticed faint voices across the river. I sat up and saw 5 men standing near a small boat tied to the riverbank. They didn't notice me. and it took me only a moment to realize I was watching a drug deal. My German isn't the best, so I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but briefcases and duffel bags were being exchanged. I figured I'd wait it out and stay quiet. Then, one of the men shouted something angrily in German, pointing a gun at another man. There was a tense silence, and the guy raised his hands, talking quickly. It looked like a setup. They stripped him of his belongings, and I knew I needed to get out of there. As I slowly moved, one of them spotted me and yelled, "There's someone there." I ran without looking back, hearing them shout behind me, the only words I understood being "don't shoot." I ran until I felt sick and nearly passed out. Sometimes I think about how I could have died that night if they'd decided to shoot. It makes me feel like I'm destined to keep running. On another note, I'll admit I've spent more time chasing women than I care to admit, but I've toned it down since college, partly because of what I'm about to tell you. I went to school in California where the social scene was open and frankly pretty wild. My sophomore year, I pledged a fraternity and quickly got tired of only dating sorority girls, especially since most seemed to know every other guy in the frats. I started using Tinder to mix things up and soon matched with someone who seemed cool. After a few days of chatting, we made plans to meet at Tap House, my favorite college bar with pool tables. I got there early planning to warm up a bit, but after an hour I figured I'd been stood up. Just as I was about to leave, I got an email. It was her, saying she'd just arrived. I greeted her, and we got some drinks, played pool, and had fun. She was Latina and drank heavily, and I got plastered trying to keep up. At one point, she asked for my Instagram, and seconds after I gave it to her, she sent me explicit photos. I was too drunk to question it. She texted, "Your turn," and I complied without thinking, even though we were sitting a few feet apart. Hours later, as things wound down, she invited me to her place. We Ubered to her apartment, which turned out to be in Oakland, a red flag I ignored. As I stepped into her dark apartment, two large, bald men appeared, blocking the door. Another guy was standing in front of me. I froze as the man in front began telling me my name, age, and birthday. He then said the girl was only 17, meaning I'd unknowingly exchanged explicit photos with a minor. He suggested I cooperate, which I did, handing over my phone, wallet, and keys. The man then revealed that he was a major drug distributor in Northern California and threatened to expose me as a criminal unless I helped distribute his product to my fraternity. They gave me a piece of paper demanding I write down my address and contacts. Desperate, I convinced them to let me use my phone to access more contacts. But when I saw an opportunity, I ran out the door. I ended up pounding on the door of a nearby house, begging to use their phone and call 911. After explaining everything to the police, an officer took me back to find the apartment. But by then, the place was deserted, with no signs anyone had ever been there. Weeks later, police confirmed it was likely gang-related but never made any arrests. That was years ago, and I'm sure this incident has since been lost amid Oakland's rampant crime and drug activity. Looking back, I realized this was probably not even a top priority compared to what goes on in that area. I haven't used a dating app since. I'm not someone who grew up with any type of sleep disorder, like sleep paralysis or night terrors. I've always been a heavy sleeper, so what I'm about to share was a real shock to me. We all have nightmares now and then, and I used to think of them as free, immersive horror movies. That probably sounds strange, but in a way, I sometimes enjoyed the thrill of waking up after a nightmare. At the time, I was living with my roommate Patricia, who I just called Trish. We had different work schedules, so we didn't see each other much except on weekends. This happened in July, I remember, because it was so hot I kept my window AC unit running on full blast every night, which doubled as white noise to help me sleep better. The first night I had the nightmare was a few days after a rough breakup, and life wasn't great. In the dream, I was in a room filled with family members sitting silently around a dinner table. Across from me stood what I could only describe as a creature resembling one of the aliens from the movie Signs, only with horns and claws. It was like something out of a sleep paralysis episode, but I was still in the dream. The next thing I knew, the creature was standing beside me, looking down at me. I ran away in the dream, ending up in a room that looked like mine before everything went black. When I woke up, my room was pitch black except for the AC fan blasting away. My heart was racing a bit, and I thought to myself that was one creepy dream. I looked around my room, shrugged it off, and went back to sleep. The following night, I woke up in the middle of the night to find my bedroom door open, even though I usually keep it shut, unless I've been drinking. My first thought was that Trish had checked on me, so I got up, closed the door, and went back to bed. The next morning I texted Trish to ask if she'd come into my room, but she denied it. I figured I must have just forgotten to close it, even though that rarely happens. The night after that, I had another nightmare. This time I was in a dark, empty room with the same creature from the previous dream. It kept getting closer to me, but oddly, I don't remember it actually moving. It just kept appearing nearer and nearer until it was looming over me. I felt frozen, unable to move, as it scratched my thigh with a claw, and I could swear I felt real pain. The next thing I knew, I woke up heart pounding. The room was dark again, the AC on full blast, but I felt a stinging sensation on my thigh. When I touched it, I was horrified to feel something raw on my skin. I rushed to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, gasping when I saw a fresh gash on my thigh. Panicked, I ran to Trisha's room and woke her up. She looked at the scratch and asked, "How on earth did you get that?" I had no answer. We went to my room and turned over all the sheets, searching for anything sharp or a bug that might have caused it. Nothing made sense. Then Trish said, "Wait," and turned off the AC unit. The room went eerily silent, and suddenly we both heard a faint sound coming from under my bed, a sound that could only come from another person breathing. Somehow we managed not to scream. We looked at each other, then bolted from the room and out of the apartment. We pounded on our neighbor's door, and he let us in, letting us use his phone to call 911. While waiting for the police, we heard a door slam, probably our own, but none of us looked out the window in time to see who it was. When the police arrived, they confirmed that whoever had been there was gone. We'd left the lights on when we ran out, so the intruder must have known we'd discovered them. As I reflected on my dreams later, it dawned on me that the demon in my nightmares represented this person lurking in our apartment. Even on that first night, when my door was mysteriously open, this stranger might have been moving around, even eating our food. The fact that this person scratched my thigh hard enough to leave a mark is deeply disturbing. The New York City subway system can be a terrifying place. I've been an MTA worker for 7 years, and not much surprises me anymore. When friends and family ask if I have any stories, though, there is one that stands out, something I still can't explain. This happened about 2 years into the job, but I remember it like it was yesterday. By that point, I was pretty acclimated, and things had become routine. I was stationed in Brooklyn, doing some maintenance at High Street Station. The platform was completely empty, which felt eerie. You're so used to these subway stations being filled with people that seeing one deserted feels unnatural. Hours passed without a soul around, and the silence was almost unsettling, broken only by the hum of lights and the occasional train. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a clang echo down the track, so sudden that I dropped my mop in shock. It sounded like something heavy had hit the metal rail, almost like a rock. I stopped what I was doing and listened, glancing into the tunnel. But after a while, I figured it was probably an animal or a loose piece of cement falling. After all, these stations are pretty old. I went back to work, trying to shrug it off. About 10 minutes later, the same sound came again, only this time it was twice as loud. Now I was a little concerned, dare I say, scared. I wondered if 2 chunks of the ceiling had fallen in such a short span of time. I set down my tools and walked over to the tunnel entrance, straining to see anything in the darkness. I debated calling out, but ultimately decided against it. I assumed it was still nothing, but my nerves were on edge, trying to figure out what could make a sound like that twice. Trying to shake it off, I focused back on work, finding my rhythm again. I was almost finished when I heard something that sent chills down my spine, a child's voice calling for help from inside the tunnel, sounding distressed. I froze, then moved quickly to the platform edge. I hesitated for a few seconds, debating if this was really happening, but I couldn't just ignore a kid in trouble. Steeling myself, I climbed down onto the tracks, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I shouted into the tunnel, asking if he was okay. No response. That was strange and made me feel even more nervous. Then, the child's voice echoed again, pleading for help. I yelled back, asking if he could hear me. He answered yes, and I asked where he was specifically. After a brief pause, he replied, "In front of you. Just keep walking." Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't leave some helpless kid alone in a dangerous tunnel. I took a few cautious steps forward, but then a thought struck me. I asked, "What's wrong?" There was a long, uncomfortable silence before the child finally said, "Just keep walking." By now, my eyes had adjusted, and I could make out a shadow up the tracks that looked like a child. But as I looked closer, I saw something else that almost made me scream, a much taller figure standing behind the kid, unmistakably an adult. My blood ran cold. This was not right. Moving as quietly as I could, I turned and made my way back to the platform, thankful that I wasn't chased. As I climbed back up, the child's voice called out, "Wait, where are you going?" I ignored it and headed up the stairs, my heart pounding. As soon as I got cell service, I called the police and told them everything. Within minutes, they swarmed the platform. After about 20 minutes of searching, they found something that gave everyone chills: a single child's shoe lying in the tunnel, suggesting some kind of struggle. They combed the area for hours, checking every database for missing children, and told us they'd call if they found anything. It was concluded that whoever had been down there had hidden deeper within the tunnels. I have no idea what to make of this experience. My best theory is that some twisted person kidnapped a child and forced him to call for help to lure an unsuspecting Good Samaritan into a trap. Or even worse, maybe the kid was being raised by someone equally deranged. It's terrifying to imagine what that child might be going through. When I was 21, I often found myself alone at my parents' house. We lived beside a small pond, which was directly in our backyard. Across the pond was a small town park. And though we had neighbors, the houses were spaced out on this upscale, expensive block compared to the rest of the town. The properties were large and quiet. I'm fully moved out now, but back then I was in college. My parents, who have multiple homes, made good money, so I was often alone there. It was a random summer night when this happened. I was off from school, so I can't remember if it was a weekend or weekday. Chances are, it was a weekday. I was sitting in the sunroom watching a show. This was my favorite room in summer, cozy and airy with all the windows open. I was on the corner of the couch near the window when I heard splashing from outside. It could have been a goose or a duck. They sometimes fight in the water, making a lot of noise. At first, I ignored it, but as it went on, I turned down the TV volume and listened closer. I leaned toward the window and realized these splashes were too heavy to be from a duck or goose. It sounded like a person. I opened the sunroom door and stepped out onto the deck, looking into the darkness of the backyard. Then, I heard a man's humming along with the splashes. Someone was definitely in the water trespassing. Each property along the pond owned a specific portion of it. I stepped inside to switch on the deck lights, hoping to get a glimpse. As soon as I did, the splashing and humming stopped. It was clear the person had seen me. I wondered if it might be a neighbor out for a strange late swim, though no one ever swam in the pond. Regardless of who it was, I wasn't about to confront them. I stepped back inside, turned off the lights, and locked the door. I texted my brother, who was away at college, but he didn't reply immediately. I tried to keep watching TV, but it was hard to focus. I kept glancing out the window, but all I could see was darkness. I still had the TV on in the background, forgetting how much light it cast outside. Then, I thought I heard a noise on the deck. I scrambled to find the remote and turn off the TV. As the room went black and silent, I heard a heavy breathing sound just outside one of the windows. I instantly lay flat on the couch to hide. A moment of silence passed, then a deep voice from outside the window said, "I see you." My heart sank. I wasn't sure whether to respond or stay quiet, but I blurted, "Paul, is that you?" Paul was the name of one of our neighbors. I hoped it was just him playing a prank, but there was no response. I only heard footsteps fading away, barefoot across the deck. I lay still, too scared to move. After a few minutes, I bolted up to check the doors. They were all locked. I messaged my family, explaining what had happened. My dad told me to turn on the backyard lights and check if anyone was still there. He wanted me to be the man of the house, as he put it. So I grabbed a knife, peered out the back deck window, and saw nothing. However, when I stepped outside, I noticed wet footprints on the deck, barefoot ones, partially dried. Following the trail around the side of the deck, I froze in shock. The top of someone's head, with eyes and forehead visible, was peering just over the deck's edge from below, watching me. As soon as our eyes met, he turned away. At that point, I was done. I went inside, locked up, and called 911. They arrived soon after, and I felt a wave of relief. They asked if our family had any enemies or if we had issues with neighbors, but nothing came to mind. They did a quick check around the property before leaving. That night, I closed every window and turned on the air conditioning. The next morning, I was relieved to see the daylight. To this day, I don't believe that man ever returned, and we still don't know who he could have been. As I'm writing this, it's early July, but this story took place at the start of summer. Usually, I hang around my college town or travel to Europe during summer to avoid going home. But that wasn't an option this time. So I found myself reluctantly heading back home at the beginning of the season. I just had to make it through 1 week, and then I'd be off to Germany. I didn't really feel like reconnecting with old friends, but I also wasn't keen on staying home. So I spent my days hiking, watching movies, or just driving around aimlessly. On my last day at home, I felt restless and wanted to do something more exciting. Back in the day, my friends and I used to hop trains, one of many reckless activities I'd since given up. I decided why not, and drove to a secluded set of tracks I knew, where freight trains frequently passed. This spot was surrounded by trees and dense vegetation, which was part of the reason I picked it. The last thing I needed was getting caught doing something illegal after all these years. I parked my car and walked over to the tracks. To give you a clear picture, this set of tracks ran through the trees, then entered a tunnel that opened to a small clearing, leading to a long bridge over water. My friends and I used to ride all the way across the bridge, but being alone, I didn't want to risk getting stranded, so I decided I'd hop on, ride through the tunnel, and hop off to walk back to my car. I wandered along the tracks, waiting for a train. It was about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. After a few minutes, I felt the familiar vibration in the rails and quickly moved to the side to stay out of sight. Freight train conductors usually don't care about people near the tracks, but I didn't want to take any chances. I waited for a good number of cars to pass before picking one that looked easy to jump onto. I ran alongside it, grabbed the ladder, and swung myself up with ease as I'd done many times before. Just as my part of the train entered the tunnel, I saw a strange flash of light ahead. I assumed it was a spark from the train, but it looked different. I hoped it wasn't an exposed wire or anything dangerous. But there was no turning back, as the train had picked up speed. Then, out of nowhere, a hand reached from the darkness and grabbed my leg. I nearly lost my grip, screaming and kicking wildly, but the train sped along before I made contact with anything. I barely had a moment to process this when another hand slapped against my leg. Terrified, I scrambled up the ladder to get out of reach, my heart pounding. As soon as the train exited the tunnel, I jumped off without thinking and watched as it chugged over the bridge. I paced back and forth in the clearing, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Were there really people in that tunnel? And what were they doing there? The worst part hit me then. The only way back to my car was through the tunnel. There was no way I was walking through the tunnel with those people inside, especially since they'd be able to see my silhouette while I'd be in complete darkness. I sat down, weighing my options. I couldn't risk crossing the bridge since a train could come at any moment. I thought about calling for help, but with no cell service out here, and the fact that I was technically trespassing, police weren't really an option. With no choice, I grabbed a rock for self-defense and started making my way through the tunnel. I got to the point where I'd felt the second hand grab me, and suddenly I heard a faint clicking sound echoing through the darkness. It sounded like someone clicking their tongue, but it could have been anything. I froze, realizing how dangerous it was to be in there. Mustering up some confidence, I pulled out my phone and shouted, "You better stay back or I'll shoot." The clicking stopped, and I pulled up a gunshot sound effect on YouTube, cranking up my phone's volume. The sound blasted through the tunnel, and I prayed it would scare off whoever was in there. Without waiting, I sprinted as fast as I could through the darkness, bracing myself for whatever might happen. By some miracle, I made it to the other side without incident. When I turned back, I saw another flash in the tunnel, briefly illuminating 2 silhouettes standing on the tracks, facing me. That was it for me. As I jogged away, a chilling, screeching sound echoed from the tunnel. It sounded human but distorted, like something out of a nightmare. I don't plan on ever train hopping again. It was August, and my girlfriend Cass and I had planned a weekend getaway at my family's rustic mobile home. It had running water, electricity, and a toilet, so we liked to call it luxury camping. The place was small, about 600 square feet, with 1 bedroom, a pull-out couch in the living room, 1 bathroom, and a tiny kitchen. Despite its remote location, there was a lot to do: archery, shooting, dirt biking, and off-roading. we had a little itinerary planned for the weekend. On Friday, we mostly unpacked, went out to eat, did some grocery shopping, and relaxed. Saturday, we tried out most of the activities until the clouds rolled in and it felt like a storm was coming. Sensing a big one, we quickly put everything back into the shed and settled inside, watching a movie while cooking dinner. Not long after, rain started pounding on the roof, followed by thunder crashing directly overhead. Cass and I decided to sit outside under the awning to enjoy the storm. Long bolts of lightning lit up the sky as thunder boomed nearly right after. We were right in the storm's heart when we heard a voice calling from the woods. It was a loud voice but muffled by the storm, making it hard to make out words. Given how remote our location was, hearing anyone else around was already odd, and during a storm like this, it was especially alarming. Thinking it might be a lost hiker, I stepped to the edge of the deck, getting slightly wet as rain blew under the canopy. With the constant flashes of lightning, I could see out to the tree line where I spotted someone. I told Cass, and she instantly thought I was kidding, but I wasn't. I considered calling out to ask if they needed help, but decided against it, a little unsettled myself. I didn't want to scare Cass any further, so I said it's probably just a hiker. She asked if we should offer help, but I suggested we only open the door if they came knocking. Curiosity got the better of me though, and I went back to the deck's edge. The lightning flashed again, and I saw the figure much closer now, only about 20 feet away. My heart pounded as I realized it was a man standing completely still, staring at the deck. I quickly went inside and locked the door. Cass noticed my expression, and her worry deepened when I said, "I don't know who that is." I tried to keep her calm, saying they'd probably knock if they needed shelter. But instead of a knock, we heard a strange shuffling sound outside, followed by the sound of someone trying the door handle. I felt adrenaline rush through me, and Cass retreated to the bedroom, calling for me to come. The noises stopped, but there had been no knock, only attempts to get inside. I told Cass to stay in the bedroom while I went to check the window. I turned off the living room lamp and took a deep breath before yanking open the curtain. Outside, I saw a white figure, the man running away from the window, quickly disappearing into the darkness. I hoped he'd left for good, but as I moved to the kitchen window, which had no blinds, I suddenly saw a face pressed against it. Even through the rain-blurred glass, I could make out his face, staring right at me. I shouted, "Go away," but he didn't move. Now, I know it sounds cliché, but there was no Wi-Fi at the home, and during storms, cell reception was virtually non-existent. My only option was my dad's rifle, which he kept under the bed in the bedroom. I went back, grabbed it, and loaded it in front of Cass, making it clear things were serious. Suddenly, a loud bang hit the bedroom window, followed by another bang from the living room. There were multiple people out there. This was too far. I positioned myself by the front door, prepared to defend us if anyone tried to break in. After a few deep breaths, I unlocked the door, yanked it open, and aimed the rifle. No one was there, so I stepped outside onto the deck, my adrenaline guiding every move. I scanned the area, making sure no one was hiding close by, then looked toward the steps. Standing at the bottom was the figure in bright clothing, still as if trying to intimidate me. He looked up, realizing I was outside, though I doubted he knew I was armed. I fired a warning shot into the air, and he yelled, "Oh shit," as he took off into the darkness. I heard at least two voices shouting to each other as they ran away, leaving only the sound of the storm. The next morning, Cass and I packed up and left. There were no signs that anyone had tampered with the car or damaged the home. Out of all the years my family has owned the place, this was the only time something like this had happened. It left me feeling uneasy about staying there alone again. Though I've gone back a few times with family, I know now I'll never go there by myself. What I'm about to share is the reason my parents decided to leave the house that had been in our family for 3 generations. I've struggled with depression for much of my life, often feeling a sense of uselessness. I'm doing much better now, but when I was a kid, it was terrible. I spent a lot of time alone in my room because of it. Our house was nestled in a heavily wooded area, surrounded by trees on 3 sides, with a forest separating us from any neighbors. My room was fairly large for a bedroom, located in the back corner of the house, so both windows faced the woods. For a kid my age, it was honestly pretty eerie. It didn't help that I was also afraid of the dark. Strange things began happening when I was around 10 years old. I was in the 5th grade and no longer allowed to crawl into my parents' bed after nightmares. They often chalked things up to my overactive imagination. The first thing I noticed was my night light. It had multiple color settings, and I usually kept it on red, which helped me fall asleep. One night, though, I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, unusual for me since I was typically a deep sleeper. Just before I drifted back to sleep, I noticed that my night light was a different color than the red I always left it on. I dismissed it at first, but about a week later, I noticed the same thing again. In the morning, I asked my parents if they were messing with my night light, but they looked confused and said they didn't know what I was talking about. They told me it was probably just glitching, which seemed believable enough, so I accepted it. That is, until one morning I woke up to find my night light unplugged, lying on the floor. My parents brushed it off again, saying I should focus on school. A few days later, the night light disappeared entirely. It seemed to have vanished. I was convinced my parents had taken it, believing I'd outgrown it. This led to a huge argument, with each of us accusing the other of lying, neither willing to back down. I couldn't believe my parents would lie to me about something so simple, but there was nothing more I could do. Things settled down for about a week, but then the strange occurrences returned. For 3 nights straight, I woke up in the middle of the night without knowing why. After the 4th night, I told my parents, but they just attributed it to puberty and natural changes in my sleep. The next time it happened, I stayed awake, hoping to figure out what was going on. A few minutes after I woke up, I heard faint rustling noises coming from my closet. When I told my parents, my dad checked the closet and found nothing but old toys and posters. The next 4 nights were the most terrifying of my life. Each time I woke up, I heard rustling from the closet. It became unbearable, and I finally begged my parents to believe me. My dad, frustrated, dragged me to the closet to prove there was nothing there. He angrily tossed toys around, clearing the closet bit by bit, until he removed one of the posters on the wall. Both of my parents froze, horrified, staring at a massive hole concealed behind the poster. My mom started screaming as my dad grabbed a flashlight. The hole was too deep to see where it led, so he went outside to investigate. At the base of the house, he found a small hole in the dirt. Digging a little revealed that it was more than just a dovette. There was actually a hidden passageway from the woods to my room. My mom and I left that night to stay at my aunt's house, and we moved out shortly afterward. I stayed at my aunt's until the move was complete. Thinking about this experience still chills me, but I know I'll have to confront it eventually. My parents refuse to discuss it, likely because they feel guilty for not believing me sooner. It's terrifying to think that someone could have been in my room every night for over a month. I have no idea what their intentions were, and I may never know. If your kids come to you with something unusual, believe them, it might be more serious than you think. I never thought anything truly horrific would ever happen to me. I'm just an average person with a pretty ordinary life, so anything unusual was really unexpected. Because of that, I never had an issue watching or listening to those creepy stories on YouTube. I still do, but after my own experience, these tales scare me in a whole new way. It was late at night, around 4 a.m., though I can't say for certain. Everyone else in my house was asleep, my mom and both of my grandparents. For the past 2 months, we'd been getting at least one major thunderstorm a week, and tonight's storm had started earlier. I've always enjoyed a good thunderstorm, especially at night, when you can sit by the window and watch the lightning. But the wind has always made me uneasy. Something about the way it can switch from gentle to deafening in an instant just gives me chills. This particular thunderstorm was one of the worst we'd had in a long time. It sounded like rocks were hitting my window. I was enjoying listening to it as I browsed Reddit until, all of a sudden, the power went out in a flash. It was a little unsettling, but I didn't mind much since I still had data and a decent charge on my phone. I continued browsing for a while until I got tired and decided it was time to get some sleep. I set my phone on the bedside table and rolled over. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly, because the next thing I remember was waking up to eerie silence, with only the faint sound of the wind outside. I turned over to get more comfortable, but realized just how parched I was. After a few minutes, I gave up on falling back asleep and decided to grab a glass of water. I picked up my phone, turned on the flashlight, and opened my bedroom door. I was immediately hit by a blast of cold air. It was freezing in the living room. I threw on a sweater and made my way to the kitchen. The closer I got, the louder the wind sounded, and the colder it seemed. When I entered the kitchen, I grabbed a glass from the cupboard and began filling it with water. That's when I noticed something strange. The door to the patio was open. Naturally, I was freaked out. I tried to rationalize it by telling myself that maybe my grandfather had left it open earlier and forgot. I walked over to the sliding door, glanced over my shoulder out of pure paranoia, and quickly shut and locked it. Then I fast walked back to my room, feeling uneasy. Back in my room, I placed the water on my bedside table, flashlight still in hand. I tried to calm myself down, but a nagging feeling told me something wasn't right. After a moment, I got up and dragged a chair over to my door to block it, just in case. I checked my closet, feeling a bit silly, and then laid back down with the flashlight still on as a makeshift nightlight. That's when the most disturbing thing I've ever experienced happened. I felt a slight bump from under my bed, followed by the creak of the bed springs. That's when it hit me I hadn't checked under the bed. I felt my stomach drop as I leaned over the side of the bed and shined the flashlight underneath. There, staring back at me, was an emaciated woman with bloodshot eyes and yellowed teeth, smiling at me with a twisted, unnatural grin. I was frozen in horror as she stared for a few seconds before cackling like a witch. My instincts kicked in, and I leaped out of bed toward the door, moving the chair out of the way and sprinting down the hall to my grandparents' room. I pounded on the door, calling out for my grandfather. He came out within seconds, gun in hand, something I didn't even know he owned. We rushed to my room, my grandmother following behind. Just as we entered, we caught a glimpse of a white figure running away from the bedroom window. My grandfather fired a warning shot, hoping to scare them off. We decided not to call the police, figuring they wouldn't be able to do much since we didn't have security cameras and had no idea who she was. I can only guess that she was severely ill or disturbed and saw my light before the power went out. I have no idea what her intentions were or if she even understood what she was doing. We're having all the windows and doors fitted with secure locks next week. All I can say is, even if you live in a safe area, bad things can still happen, and it's always important to take precautions. This happened when I was a little kid living in our old house in Suffolk County, Long Island. I'd say I was around 6 or 7 years old. My older brother and I shared a bedroom on the top floor, which used to be a separate apartment that my dad had rented out to an elderly lady. She moved out eventually, and the upstairs area became mostly ours. The layout was like this. At the top of the stairs to the left was our bedroom, formerly her living room. Straight ahead was the bathroom, and to the right was an extra kitchen and a small bedroom. Our room was huge, with 2 crawl-in closets on opposite sides and filled with toys, games, and other stuff. Among our toys was a race car with multiple buttons. Each button would light up the car briefly and play various sound effects: honking, revving, driving sounds, and a little rock tune. It was a toy we'd had for ages, originally a gift for my brother when he was younger. One random night, my brother and I were both in bed, not yet asleep, when suddenly, like a jump scare from a horror movie, the loud revving sound of that toy car blasted out, along with the car lights flashing in the middle of the room. I looked at the car, instantly terrified, and accused my brother Luke of doing it to scare me. He was laughing hysterically, claiming he hadn't touched it. The toy eventually went silent, but I was completely unsettled, though I eventually fell asleep. Some time later, when Luke and I were in bed again, we heard a strange thud in the room. Luke tried to scare me, insisting it was a ghost, and I kept telling him to shut up or I'd call Mom. He laughed, but we both went silent when we saw a light in the corner. The toy car's lights had come on again. I bolted out of bed, ran down the stairs, and yelled for my mom, explaining in a rush about the ghost in our room, the thud, and the car's lights turning on. When Luke joined us, my mom told him to knock it off if he was trying to scare me. He pointed out that he couldn't turn on the car lights from his bed. I ended up sleeping in my parents' room that night. A long time passed without anything happening, but one night, Luke was away at a sleepover, and I was alone in the room. I had since put the toy car in the small bedroom across the hall, since it scared me. After my mom kissed me goodnight, I asked her to keep the door open because I was nervous. I turned on my side, trying to sleep, but was too uneasy. Then I heard a faint, unexplainable sound coming from down the hall. I turned to face the door, and to my horror, the toy car rolled into my room with its lights flashing. I screamed from the depths of my stomach, pressing myself against the wall as I cried for my mom. My parents rushed up the stairs moments later, finding the car on the floor. I shouted that someone had pushed the car into the room. My dad checked all the rooms, but he found no one and no possible hiding places besides the closets and under the bed, which he checked. I'm not sure what my parents thought in that moment. On one hand, they might have believed the toy was malfunctioning, but on the other, I think they were a bit freaked out themselves. That toy car didn't have any features to move on its own. To make me feel better, my dad smashed the toy and threw it in the neighbor's trash. I slept in their room for a while, though eventually my dad encouraged me back upstairs. This experience is why I believe in the paranormal and the possibility of something beyond this life. I've been smoking cigarettes every day for years. Before you judge, let me just say that I recently started seeing a therapist to address my nicotine addiction. Unfortunately, it hasn't helped much yet. The only thing worse than my addiction is my terrible sleep schedule. I don't know why, but I stay up past midnight almost every night and rarely get out of bed before noon. These parts of my life may seem unrelated, but they're essential to what I'm about to tell you. A few months ago, I was standing on my balcony, as I often do at night, smoking a cigarette. I live in a pretty secluded neighborhood, with houses spaced far apart. But there's one neighbor whose yard I can see clearly from my balcony. I'd never met the guy, but he seemed to live alone, judging by the single navy blue beam always parked in his driveway. But that particular night, there was a black van parked outside his house, a van I'd never seen before. I didn't think much of it, just noted the coincidence. The next night, I couldn't help but glance over again, and sure enough, the same black van was there. I didn't think anything sinister was going on, just found it odd. For the rest of the week, I made a bit of a game out of observing the van's comings and goings, curious about its purpose. I said I wasn't nosy, but honestly, I'm more obsessive than I like to admit. It's part of the reason I've lost touch with some friends over the years. Still, I had no intention of getting involved until something happened that changed my perspective. One night, I was up later than usual, maybe around 5 a.m., and the van was parked there as usual. I was finishing my last cigarette when I saw my neighbor come outside. He walked to the van, carrying a long black bag, which looked like it might be a set of golf clubs, except it seemed much heavier. He opened the van's sliding door and carefully placed the bag inside, then climbed into the driver's seat and sped off. I had no idea what he was carrying, but I was too tired to think about it until the next day. The following evening, I decided to head up to my balcony earlier and wait for the van to show up again. I brought my laptop to get some work done while I waited. Around 1 a.m., the van pulled into his driveway. I quickly shut my laptop and watched. Nothing happened for a few minutes. The van just sat there with the engine running. Then my neighbor stepped out, opened the side door, and pulled out the same bag from the previous night. He seemed to be struggling with its weight, barely able to keep steady as he carried it into his house. At this point, I was sure something was wrong. I didn't want to wait and watch passively anymore. I had to find out what was going on. The next morning, after flipping a coin, I decided I'd try following his van if he left again that night. I had an unproductive day, distracted by what I might find, and around 4 a.m., I stationed myself on my balcony, cigarette in hand, watching his driveway. As soon as he started moving, I rushed to my car, kept my headlights off, and began tailing him. After about 20 minutes, he turned onto a dirt path leading into the woods. I followed, realizing this path had probably once been a main road. Eventually, it led to a deserted gas station hidden in a clearing. Parked right in front of it was his Beam. I turned my car around and parked across from the dirt road, waiting for him to leave. After nearly an hour, his Beam finally pulled out, and I nervously drove up the path to the gas station. The place was eerie. The front door was locked, as were the side and back doors. Desperate to see inside, I picked up a rock and smashed one of the windows, instantly setting off a blaring alarm. Heart pounding, I sprinted back to my car and sped away, wondering why an abandoned gas station would be rigged with an alarm. I called 911, gave them a vague tip, then hung up and raced home. The next morning, I woke up hoping the whole situation had resolved itself, but when I looked out from my balcony, there were at least 8 police cars in my neighbor's driveway. I watched as officers led him out in handcuffs. One by one, the police cars drove off, leaving me alone to process what had happened. Since then, I've asked the police for details, but they won't answer any of my questions. I even tried driving back to that gas station only to find the road blocked off. Maybe one day I'll work up the courage to walk through the woods and look for answers, but for now I'm left with only my suspicions. I have a dog that I take for a walk 3 times a day, first in the morning, then in the afternoon, and finally at night. I follow the same route each time, going through our driveway exit, which leads to a cul-de-sac parking lot for the condominium complex where we live. This detail will be important soon. For our night walks, I usually go out a bit later than most people. It's just a habit I've had ever since getting him, and it's never been a problem until one particular night. I began our final walk of the day, taking our usual path. I had a flashlight with me since there are no lights in the parking lot, and I was listening to music with just one AirPod to stay aware of my surroundings. Suddenly, I heard something up ahead, a voice of some kind, but I was so lost in my music that it took a second to register. When it hit me, I paused, took out my AirPod, and listened carefully to check if I was only imagining it. Then it happened again. A voice spoke from ahead, though I couldn't see anyone. Against my better judgment, I continued walking forward, thinking it might just be in my head, but something felt off. I stopped again after a few more steps, standing near the parked cars, flashlight in hand, listening. Then, one of the creepiest things I've ever experienced happened. A muffled voice that sounded like a child's whispered the word help. My heart raced. I was frozen in place, shining my flashlight all around to locate where it was coming from. I was sure the sound was coming from between the cars, but there was no sign of anyone, not a kid, not an adult, no one. It was just me and my dog, who didn't seem to notice anything unusual as he sniffed the bushes nearby. Then I heard it again, the word help spoken 3 more times, coming from my left where the cars were parked. My panic grew as I tried to make sense of it. I knew it wasn't my imagination, especially when I noticed my dog's ears perk up as he looked in the same direction. That's when the eerie reality of the situation hit me. I listened closer, and the voice sounded strange, not exactly like a child's, more like a mix between an adult and a child. Each time it called for help, the voice was consistently muffled and emotionless, as if it wasn't a genuine cry for help. My dog and I sprinted straight home afterward, and I explained to my mom what happened. She was as puzzled as I was, but when I suggested calling the police, she didn't think it was necessary. My mind raced with questions. Why was the voice muffled? Could someone have been hiding in one of the cars? Or was it something darker, waiting for me to come closer? I try not to dwell on it, but the memory still disturbs me deeply. This picture shows the spot where I took out my AirPods to listen. I heard the sound up ahead on the left, near where the cars were parked. Some people might think the noise could have come from the condo complex on the right, but it was definitely from the direction of the cars. At the time, the vehicles parked there were trucks and SUVs, which were large and blocked my view, making it harder to see if anyone was hiding. I never found out what it was,